this demonstration of VMware Virtual SAN high availability across routed networks. In this demo, I will showcase the enterprise availability and resilient capabilities provided by Virtual SAN. In this scenario, we have an enterprise infrastructure powered by Brocade networking devices configured to support a spine leaf design across 5 individual racks where the layer 2 configuration traffic only exists in from the leaf switches and down to the ESXi host, where the rest of the network configuration is across layer 3. So let's go over the details of the virtual SAN configuration directly in the vSphere web client. So here we take a look at an actual cluster. This cluster has a bunch of virtual machines that are already running, and obviously a number of servers that have actually been already configured to go through this process. So we'll take a look at the actual configuration of the cluster, in particular some of the settings that are here. You can clearly see that virtual SAN has already been configured, but what we're going to look at is under the disk management and see that every host has been properly configured and claimed, and the disks have been claimed. But here in particular, notice that these nodes, these hosts, are placed in a particular fault domain. Now the failure domain, or the fault domain as we call it in virtual SAN, is a logical sort of abstraction or construct that allows us to let the system know or identify or understand or be aware of a rack, right? So that when we perform our replication functions for availability, we could do that in a way that no components or objects from a particular application will be placed within the same fault domain. Therefore, we can guarantee the number of failures to tolerate according to that particular policy demand. Here we're going to go with a failures to tolerate equals 2, which allows us to fail 2 complete racks, which is pretty substantial and significant in an enterprise world. Very quickly here you can see the actual VM kernel interface that's being configured and utilized for virtual SAN communications. And you can see here that each one of these nodes, every 2 nodes, they're part of a different network. And you can see that based on the actual configurations of the different racks, where the top of rack switch becomes the sort of fault domain, including from a network perspective. The point here is that we're going to look at this particular application and we're going to make sure that in an infrastructure failure of any kind, it can support up to 2 complete outages. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take it to the extreme and cause the failure of 2 individual racks at the same time. Here you can see that the policy in place is FTT equals 2, failure to tolerate equals 2, which translates to that particular failure that we're going to test here. It just basically means that the system will automatically create or maintain 3 replicas of the data in order to be able to sustain a failure of this magnitude. So what I'm going to do here is basically log into the actual switches and shut down the uplinks from the spine switch to the rack 4 and 5 leaf switches, hereby simulating that the 2 racks will go offline from a vSAN perspective. Now we're going to do this through the typical CLI process. As you can see here on the right side, that'll take place, all CLI based, on the Brocade devices. And that'll take place, and then we will see what happens to the application, that VM that we can actually still see here that is actually running. Now, just a little bit of information here as I go through these steps. Keep in mind that virtual SAN has a requirement of multicast on layer 2, which we have configured within the rack, right? But in order to the cluster to be able to find the other host that we want to utilize across the racks, we in this case have PIM enable and configure, so that we can actually take that layer 2 multicast traffic out to a protocol that can actually now route it and make it all available into one. We have some very specific white papers that have been written and published by VMware and Brocade with myself and some of the folks there, which gives you all the specific configuration details to successfully achieve that. Right now, this is all particularly done from the networking switch routing configuration perspective. For virtual SAN, running over layer 3 happens and is available natively out of the box. Okay, I just kind of wanted to state that as we go through and watch the configuration of the switches here as I shut them down. Keep in mind that in terms of magnitude of this particular failure, it's not only just about bringing down the switches. By bringing down the switches at the racks, I'm also basically eliminating all of the hosts that are part of that particular the part of a particular rack that are members of that particular cluster. So the failure that we're introducing encompasses much more than just the network, But it's important to also take a look at and understand the grand scheme of things and what's happening here. And now that we shut down the racks, let's go take a look at the cluster settings and see what's happening. As a result of what I've done, obviously this takes some time for the vSAN web client to refresh. And I'll speed up the process here just to make sure that we see some of these errors. And here you go. Here's the virtual SAN health check letting you know that there's a couple of issues going on within the system. You can clearly see that in badges and actually alerts that are being provided by virtual SAN. So there specifically network failures and data failures in terms of accessibility. So let's take a look at the important object here, the important piece of this entire demonstration. And it's the fact that that virtual machine, that application that we were looking at initially before I introduced the failure, it's still running, right? But the thing here to notice is the fact that notice that the policy says out of date, which means that currently in the current state of the cluster, we are not able to provide the same level of resiliency and availability that it was required by that particular policy. And therefore, that virtual machine, that application is not in full compliance mode. Now, how can we identify that there's a failure in terms of from a network perspective? So there's a couple of things we can look at here. So if we go to the disk management and you look at the network partition, notice how here we have a couple of different groups. We have group 2, group 1, and in group 3. And basically what it means is in order for the cluster, for the virtual SAN cluster to be properly formed, all of the nodes in terms of their multicast groups and the relationship they made, they join the same networking partition group. Here you clearly saw that there's an issue in terms of their communication because they're out. And therefore now you have this problem, this error that we sort of created. So the nodes that are in that particular rack that I just shut down are not able to communicate, and therefore they're sort of out of communication with the rest of the cluster, and it introduces that particular outage in terms of data accessibility and resiliency. But still with that in place, the actual application itself is still running, it's still available, but currently is not able to meet or satisfy the level of availability that was originally demanded for that particular application. In more details, here's actually how you look at the layout of the different disks and components of that virtual machine. And here you can clearly see that there's a witness object that's absent on rack 4, which was one of the ones that I shut down. And then there's another witness object that's absent on rack 5. But notice that there's another witness on rack 3, and the rest of the components of this particular application of virtual machine are still available in green on the other places, on the other racks, where some of the data is actually available and accessible to the rest of the system. This clearly shows you the level of data accessibility and the traceability of where these components are currently located, and as to why we are still able to continue to use that particular application and its services without having any complete sort of outage with this particular failure that we introduced into the system. Now, again, not fully compliant. If there was to be another 2 failures or another failure, we would have to recover from a backup, restore that particular device. But very important here, you sustain an outage that is not likely to happen within a particular enterprise infrastructure, or it could be very challenging. But here you have this particular capability with virtual SAN that is able to deliver all of this availability and sort of resiliency capabilities to the application as part of the platform and the features and values that it deserves and supports for you in this particular scenario. And don't get it twisted. Virtual SAN is the greatest storage platform ever created. Hyperconverged to the max. Woo!